Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Samara Centre for Democracy's online event on how provincial and territorial legislatures have adapted to the pandemic. My name is Kendall Anderson, and I'm Samara's Executive Director. We're very pleased that so many of you can join us today for a stimulating discussion on legislatures and their very different responses to the pandemic. This conversation is based on research that Samara just published as part of our Democracy Monitor series. The Democracy Monitor is Samara's contribution to the vital discussion we're all having about how our institutions and communities are adapting to the ongoing and likely long-term effects of the pandemic. We'll put the link to the full report in the chat box, and please check out all the articles and share them if you find them to be useful. As you are all starting to do, you can put your name and affiliation in the chat box if you like. And a reminder, the event will be recorded, and so we'll send you the link after it's complete. Today, we're going to hear from 4 speakers. Paul Thomas is the Samara Centre's Senior Research Associate. Paul has spent more than a decade researching Canadian politics, and he's the author of numerous articles and book chapters on legislative politics in Canada and the UK. Paul will begin by taking us through the data on all the legislatures and assemblies, and he'll then speak with each of our guests in turn. First, we'll hear from Julie Green, who's a member of the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories. Next, we'll hear from Sabrina Nanji, who's a journalist covering Ontario politics from the Legislative Press Gallery. She's also formerly the democracy reporter for the Toronto Star. Last, we'll hear from J.P. Lewis, who's an associate professor of political science at the University of New Brunswick, St. John. If you have any questions for the panelists, please put your questions into the chat box, and at the very end, we'll pull from those questions for the Q&A. And now, over to you, Paul.
Thank you so much, Kendall, and thank you to everyone who's taking some time out of their lunch or morning, depending on which time zone you might be in. I am delighted to be here and delighted that we have so much interest in the report. As Kendall said, I'm going to begin by going through some of the findings from our latest Democracy Monitor, which we released this week. So hopefully you can now all see a PowerPoint. This is my first time using it over the system, so please bear with me if there's technical challenges. But the idea of provincial legislatures, the idea of federalism, is that it allows us to divide the functions of government in a way that can be more responsive to the people. And so we were looking to see how that could play out in the pandemic, to see how provinces had provincial and territorial legislatures had adapted their workings to try to respond to COVID-19 and the challenges that it imposed, while also preserving their functions of scrutinizing the government, passing legislation, and representing citizens. What we found is that none is perfect. There's obviously some things that could be changed, and that each one was unique. Some did a bit better than others, though, and we found that especially as we look towards resuming the functions of legislatures, and especially as we have a bit of a calm after the first wave to hopefully prepare in case a second does come, that there are some things that we could look into. One other element I should say is that we divided our report into 2 sections. So the first looks at how provinces responded. And this is in the period, say, from the pandemic declaration. The World Health Organization made the declaration on March 11th, and continuing until the end of April, beginning of May, in that sort of initial response phase. And we wanted to look not only at the measures that were taken, how they were adopted, but the oversight that was put in place. And as I said, there was no identical response, but 5 patterns emerged. So some of the provinces were actually on a planned break when the pandemic hit, and they just stayed that way. 2 jurisdictions, Nova Scotia and Nunavut, had actually already passed their budgets, had their spring sittings and completed, and so they just decided to maintain that. Prince Edward Island actually hadn't sat since last November, and so they suspended or delayed the start of their sitting. Others were in the midst of their activities, and so tried to quickly move to adopt some emergency measures and then shut down. In the Yukon, this resulted in the passage of the budget, whereas in Saskatchewan and Ontario, they didn't quite have time, and so moved to some more emergency measures. Two provinces had a really unique response, and I'm very glad that JP Lewis is here so we can dig into this a bit more. But they actually set up all-party committees outside of the legislature to help govern the response and to make sure that all parties were on side with the measures that were taken. And this is quite unique in our usual Westminster system, which is based on a sharp divide between government and opposition. There was also a few jurisdictions that decided while the main legislative chamber is closed down, they moved to a virtual oversight model. So British Columbia had a couple of had one quick meeting, but then whilst the main legislature was adjourned, moved to have some virtual committee meetings. And the Northwest Territories and Quebec took this even further, having some ongoing meetings. And there's a screenshot here from the Standing Committee on Accountability and Oversight at the Northwest Territories Legislature. And I'm really glad we have Julie Green here, a member of the legislature, to talk more about how that committee has worked. In those committees, the big element is that even while question period and the usual functions of the legislature were closed, they still allowed for some scrutiny to occur. And more surprising was that two jurisdictions, Alberta and Manitoba, actually continued to some extent without as much of a break as you might expect. Whereas the others at least closed their regular sittings. Alberta had 3 sitting weeks throughout March and April, passed some legislation unrelated to the pandemic. In Manitoba as well, there was actually a budget filibuster that continued despite the pandemic arriving. And there was a longer term focus in many of the activities. Now, that was the shutdown phase. Now getting back to work. Here again, while no two jurisdictions are identical, we are seeing some trends. So there's 3 jurisdictions that remain just closed. In large part, there are press conferences happening, but no actual legislative or committee business. Nova Scotia and Nunavut, as mentioned, had already passed their budgets for the 2020 fiscal year and so remain closed. Saskatchewan is a somewhat different case where this ongoing closure has meant that the government is using some special financial provisions to make appropriations without legislative oversight. The Yukon is an interesting jurisdiction where there has been some committee activity, and the Speaker of the legislature has stated that facilities exist should the legislature wish to resume through social distancing or virtually. But so far, there have only just been 2 committees that have met. Those committees, though, however, have dealt with some business. So the Public Accounts Committee passed 2 reports. And so there's some elements of continuation, but not all that much going on. Then we see a larger group that are trying to find ways of resuming regular operations. And the 2 pictures that are seen there are from the New Brunswick legislature, where they have decided to resume operations, having all members present, but with adaptations to the chamber so that you can have some physical distancing. And so the minister who is responding to a question in the lower picture is actually seated up in the gallery because that was one of the only ways that everyone could fit in while making sure there was adequate distance. And the 2 lines there, so Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec have resumed, but they're doing so with fewer members. So they're just having a small set of the usual membership taking part in order to ensure that social distancing takes place. In contrast, New Brunswick, Northwest Territories, and PEI have made the choice to reconfigure their assemblies so that all members can be present. What's interesting in this, and we can talk with both JP and Julie as this goes, but so far, there haven't been any members who have stayed out of those 2 jurisdictions due to, say, health concerns or personal vulnerability. But in Ontario, we have seen some members who are unable or reluctant to return because of age or health condition. And lastly, 2 other legislatures are resuming operations, but they're doing it in a different way. So while those I've just talked about are looking at having people back in the physical buildings, the British Columbia and Newfoundland and Labrador legislatures are looking at trying to have a hybrid proceedings where some people will be physically present in the legislature while others will not. And so this allows for members, as I said, who may have health concerns to take part. So what can we learn from all of this? One big thing is that if legislatures aren't meeting, they can't ask questions. And so we have seen a fair bit of frustration where legislatures were initially closed, and particularly in those jurisdictions where the legislatures remain closed. And it's something where at the end of all of this, there might be a chance to hold governments accountable, but there isn't the same ability for ongoing scrutiny if the legislatures aren't sitting, or at least legislative committees aren't meeting virtually to ask questions. We were really surprised, particularly given other jurisdictions in the world have been much quicker to embrace virtual meetings, how limited it has been. We've had a few jurisdictions with virtual committees. We've had others, but just two that are actually looking at a hybrid model. And given the potential for ongoing spread, it seemed a bit odd. And so we hope, again, even if it's not used now, that some legislatures will look at the idea of virtual meetings as a way to adapt should a second wave of the pandemic emerge. We also found that legislatures that tried to move very quickly to pass laws may make mistakes. And so we saw this in Alberta. There was a bill passed that actually has been challenged on the grounds that it delegates too much power to the legislature. It would allow the creation of new laws, essentially, without returning back to the legislature. And in Newfoundland and Labrador, there was a bill passed to limit movement in and out of the province that is now facing a charter challenge for restricting freedom of movement. And so one thing out of this, again, if we look towards a second wave, rather than very quickly abbreviating the legislative process in an emergency situation, finding ways to draw out that process a bit while respecting the restraints imposed by the emergency would be helpful. One thing that has been interesting, and actually I am sorry, that should say New Brunswick and Newfoundland and Labrador, is that we've seen some places with these all-party committees that have taken the politics behind closed doors. And we'll be able to look at this more with JP. But it means that we're not entirely sure who is there to speak for those who might be critical of the actions taken. And it also means that accountability is hard to assign. And so whilst these all-party committees are encouraging in some way, it means that oversight is a bit more tricky. The other element is that as legislatures look to resume their business, we hope that they find new ways of doing it. So this is a tweet from the British Columbia legislature where they're going to be holding virtual budget consultations. And so knowing that citizens might be reluctant to come to the legislature, that civil society groups are having their own financial difficulties, finding new ways to engage would be important. Committees, as we said, are very important to try to find smaller ways of looking at some policy issues, and we'll speak more with Ms. Green about that. And the other element is that most of these jurisdictions have just abandoned their usual financial processes. It's understandable, but it, again, makes accountability really hard if there's no budget plan. And so now I am going to stop the presentation and hopefully discuss with Julie if I can work the technology. So I'm hoping that you can all see me and that I will soon be joined by Julie Green, who is a member of the legislature for the Northwest Territories. Julie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning.
One thing that really intrigued us looking at how the COVID-19 has played out in the Northwest Territories is the role that the Standing Committee on Oversight and Accountability and others played during the shutdown of the legislature itself. Could you tell us a little bit more about how that worked and how it came about?
Yes, so our legislature shut down on March 16th in the middle of the budget session. And we stayed away for 2 weeks. People went home to their constituencies, and we dealt with constituency issues there for a couple of weeks. And then at the beginning of April, we started meeting 3 times a week to look at what the government was doing in response to the pandemic, to receive briefings from them and the Chief Public Health Officer, and to generally collaborate with what was happening in response to the pandemic, given the fact that this is a consensus-based system. We have a practice of working together, together in advance. We don't just get notices that things are happening. We've usually discussed them and had some role in forming them in advance. So the Oversight and Accountability Committee is all the regular members of the Legislative Assembly. So that's people from across the NWT providing input into the shape of the pandemic response.
So it's all members who aren't part of the cabinet. Oh, that's really interesting. And so when you launched these meetings, I saw that they were streamed on Facebook and others. Did you get much public engagement or input from them?
We did get some. At the beginning, it was very focused on health. It was focused on how many cases we had, where they were, how the containment was going, and so on. And then when the containment was obviously working, then people switched their focus to economic issues. And we've all heard a lot about the economy, which was not robust before COVID and is even less robust now. So that's the kind of thing we were hearing, and there did seem to be some interest. People had, in some cases, quite a bit of time on their hands because they furloughed from their jobs.
Right. Now, you mentioned that the NWT is a consensus government, and for those who may be joining us from other jurisdictions, it's one of 2 jurisdictions in Canada that doesn't have political parties. So members are elected and then form a cabinet, elect a premier and form a cabinet amongst themselves. I'm just curious, when, in light of that process, and you mentioned this to some extent, how did the decision-making go about resuming sittings, given that in some other jurisdictions, it's very much been a government matter as to deciding when a legislature should resume sitting or even how?
Right. Well, in the Northwest Territories, that's a caucus matter. It's for all 19 members to consider. So we looked at 4 different options for resuming. Not resuming at all was one option. Resuming with limited representation was another option. Resuming with business as usual per the Chief Public Health Officer's orders, which order, of course, physical distancing. And the last choice was virtual. And so we all agreed we needed to sit. Because we're so spread out in the Northwest Territories, it's very difficult to say that we can be representative without being all together. And the virtual meetings, which we've been having, have some technology, bandwidth, capacity issues, so that we couldn't for sure have everybody with a camera and a microphone participating as we are here, because the technology is just not doesn't exist in all the communities. So what we decided to do was then to do the modification. We've modified our legislature, as New Brunswick has done, to accommodate people at a greater distance within there. And we have legislation coming forward in this session, which we started on Tuesday, which will allow for virtual sittings as soon as the technology catches up.
Oh, wow. I'm just curious, what you mentioned the legislature resumed sitting this week. What has been the focus?
Well, the focus is the response to the pandemic. There have been a number of issues that have been steadily coming up over the time. Enforcement of the Chief Public Health Officer's orders, assistance to small business, assistance to people who found themselves unemployed, the collapse of our tourism industry. So it's been primarily about the pandemic. There are some other items on the order paper, but it's primarily about the pandemic and about finishing the budget for the fiscal year we're now in.
And so does the budget essentially have to be rewritten now in light of COVID, or just sort of knowing that there will be some large question marks about how things will play out?
Yeah, so the way we develop a budget and consensus is that we develop it together behind the scenes. It's not as if we just hear about it first on budget day. We have what it says. So it was produced, and we can't replicate that process in the time we have available. So what we are going to do, and what we normally do, is fill in the holes through supplementary appropriations. So the budget as it stands now it is being debated department by department, and it will hopefully be passed by the beginning of June. And then any additional COVID spending or holes that have appeared in the budget will be addressed through supplementary appropriations.
So it sounds like there's a fair bit of work looking forward, but I'm curious, is there also any practices underway with the legislature committees to sort of evaluate and critique the responses that were made in March and April, to see how effective they were and what could be done if a second wave does arrive?
Yes, the standing committees that provide oversight over the government departments, the three of them, have each taken on the task of responding to the government's pandemic responses, evaluating their usefulness and making recommendations about them. So there are 3 reports coming into the Legislative Assembly for debate on June the 9th, which represent our thinking about what should happen from here going forward.
Wow. Could you, I know your time is tight, so please just let us know if you have to go. But if you have a few moments, could you let us know what it's like being a constituency representative in this time? How has it affected your office? What kind of requests are you seeing?
Yeah, my time is good this morning, Paul.
Okay.
I have never, this is my 5th year as an MLA, and I've never had so many calls, and never have the stakes been higher, with people calling me about being evicted, about losing their jobs, about losing revenue in their businesses, having to miss rent payments and so on. I'm really touched by both the number of calls and the importance of the calls. These are really substantive matters that people are bringing forward. So it's really been a challenging time. Of course, a lot of government offices have been closed, territorial government, federal government, city government. So I feel that our constituency assistants have had a lot of overflow from that. And people don't necessarily think hard about which level of government they are asking the question of. So, we have an ad in the paper every week, so they call us, and so then it's on us to sort things out. But I'm going to say that the federal MP's constituency assistant was probably very busy at this point as well. So at the beginning, it was just trying to get a grip on all this information of and announcements from the federal government and the territorial government, trying to understand what was on offer and how it related to our constituents, assisting them to access the loans or money. It's been incredibly busy. When people say, how's your COVID break? I just say, I'm looking forward to it.
Well, and I'm curious, so you mentioned that the containment strategy went well. And I'm just wondering, now, as you're looking forward, is the constituency pressure also encouraging a full reopening? Is there, I can understand that there might be a bit more pressure to open the doors wider, given the success you've had.
Yes, that's right. There is substantial pressure for the Chief Public Health Officer to reopen the border. She's already indicated she won't do that until there's a vaccine. So those are 2 positions that are poles apart. And the way things are set up now, our border is closed. People who don't live here are not welcome at this time. And people who do live here and who've come from another jurisdiction have to self-isolate for 14 days. Staff who come in to work have to self-isolate for 14 days. So we have very limited movement into the territory at this time. And government is paying for the self-isolation in hotel rooms and providing meals. So they're very serious about keeping people isolated. There's a real push to protect our fragile medical system. In the whole of the NWT, we have 6 intensive care unit beds. And so we just can't have community spread here with the numbers of cases that we're seeing in southern jurisdictions. We just don't have any capacity to deal with that. And so our best bet is to continue keeping the borders closed, but that comes at a real cost, and I want to recognize that.
And now, just as one final question, consensus is often seen as something that is just not achievable in politics. Do you find the consensus government system helped the territory's response, or did it slow things down in a way? Did it prevent sort of rapid action and decisive measures from being taken?
Consensus government, like all forms of government, it really rests on the personalities of the people in leadership. And so the current premier and the new premier is very inclusive and collaborative. So we've spent a lot of time talking. Consensus is code for talking your head off. So we've spent a lot of time talking about the pandemic responses. We've been consulted every step of the way. We haven't always agreed with what comes out the other end, but that consensus doesn't mean agreement. It means discussion. And so I have to say that I'm reasonably satisfied with the whole of government response to this. Considering that this is our first pandemic, the stakes were so high, our capacity so limited, I think we've done okay.
Thank you so much for taking the time. And if you can stay for the rest of the discussion, that would be great, but I understand if you have another meeting to go to.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul. I'll stay until the end.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Julie. Okay, and now I think we're going to be joined by Sabrina for going from one of Canada's smallest jurisdictions to one of Canada's largest jurisdictions for a look at how the pandemic has played out. Thank you so much for joining us, Sabrina.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So actually, I'm just curious that in contrast to what we saw in the NWT, where there was some effort to keep the committees going, to continue a bit of oversight amongst members, we sort of saw the opposite play out in Ontario, where there was a pretty hard shutdown. Committee work was suspended. I'm just wondering if you could give us a quick flavor of what that looked like, and why there wasn't perhaps a move to say have virtual committees or that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I think at the outset of the pandemic, the government, just like the rest of us, there was a lot of uncertainty about what we're up against. For one, the government suspended just before our March break, the March break constituency week. So I think that just sort of seemed like a logical time to extend that. It was also 2 weeks before the Ford government was going to put out their budget. And so that sort of, I guess the pandemic has blown the budget out of the water. The government has acknowledged that now, and they've had to sort of shift gears to focus on the pandemic response, and almost everything else was, for the moment, put on the back burner.
Wow, no, thank you for that. And actually, I'm getting a signal from our technical team asking if you could speak a little bit louder or move a bit closer to the mic.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much. So the sittings have resumed. There was sort of one sitting a few weeks ago, and then the last 2 weeks have resumed regularly. Can you give us just an overview of what that looks like and how it's playing out?
Yeah, so the legislature has started to come back now. Actually, just this week in Ontario, the government had laid out a motion for the summer sittings going forward. But right now, they're sitting twice a week. Tuesdays and Wednesdays, there's question period, and if there's any other business, pandemic-related legislation, the government can handle that. All of that requires unanimous consent to get the business done quickly. The PCs here in Ontario have a majority, but they really rely on the opposition, and all parties have been working behind the scenes on pandemic-era proceedings. And there has been some cooperation, but I think now that the legislature has started to ramp back up again, we have a bit more knowledge about what we're dealing with, that some of that camaraderie is being chipped away at. And I think that we're seeing the opposition wanting a bit more involvement, and I think maybe we can get into that a little bit more, but it does seem to be like there's a back and forth, and this is a constant negotiation.
So that's interesting. So it was, we did, I think, our first Democracy Monitor looking at how things were working out at the federal level, where the parties were working they would work behind closed doors, show up at the legislature, and then very quickly pass things by unanimous consent for the pandemic response. And so it sounds quite similar Even though the legislature is now back 2 days a week, it sounds like it's still a similar process for at least the emergency legislation.
Yeah, that's what's been happening. But now we're starting to see maybe some of these backroom negotiations are falling apart a little bit. This week we had the NDP, the official opposition, and the PCs pointing the fingers at each other about how they both broke the backroom agreements. One of the agreements is to have a limited number of MPPs in the House when they do sit. And so that way they can do physical distancing. The PCs still hang on to their majority, but what we're seeing is at least now the parties are starting to come and publicly say what they're not liking in these backroom negotiations. So at least for the public and for us reporters, I think that's a good thing to bring that out a little more in the public.
Well, and actually, just to that point, you mentioned there was this agreement to limit the number of members present. So I think it's been like 21 most days who've been there. But how do they decide, which communities effectively get represented and which are left on the sidelines?
Yeah, so because there are like semi-regular sittings now twice a week, we're seeing more MPPs coming from far away, whereas when they were doing the emergency sittings to pass the mini budget bill, for instance, we tended to see MPPs from around the GTA, close to Toronto, where Queen's Park is, that they could get there without a huge trek. Last week, we had Franz Jelena who's from Nickelbelt, so that's up north, far away. She made it down to Queen's Park, and she was able to participate. She asked questions, she got her moment, and I think that now the government, I'm sure they have their own rotations, but there's a maximum of 42 was the initial agreement. We saw quite a few more PCs pack the House yesterday, because they were worried about maybe not making the numbers for their vote. But generally, it's been maximum 42, and it's been it's in relation to the size and the party makeups in the House anyway. So you'll have a majority of PCs, then followed by the NDP and the Independents.
So there's not a sense necessarily that anyone's being silenced or kept out from saying their piece. As was a bit of a concern federally when we saw, for example, one MP who hadn't been asked to attend sort of take it upon himself to be there at the legislature.
Yeah, if there has been, complaints, I don't think any MPPs have been very loud about it. It seems like most parties are really happy with the government House Leader, Paul Calandra, and say that, he's been working, doing his best to make sure everyone who wants to have a chance to speak. Randy Hillier, former PC, now independent, is known as being an outspoken MPP. He does have some issues with some of the emergency response, but he also got a seat as an independent, which is not normally the case, on the financial committee that's studying the recovery response. So I think that there's definitely been a conscious effort, even though the opposition and probably some conservative backbenchers as well would like the chances to participate more, which again, like if we could talk more about the summer sittings, I think that those opportunities could come up.
And actually, I was just going to say, so how is the business, so I mean, with Julie, it sounded like there was a mix of sort of a retrospective on what happened, looking at trying to perhaps do some accountability on the pandemic side of the emergency responses, but then also looking forward about what measures might be taken for the recovery, looking at maybe other pieces of business that might be up. How is that playing out? You mentioned there was this special committee to look at the financial side of things.
Yeah, so the opposition had wanted a standalone special committee, but what the government chose to do was expand a standing committee. So this is Finance and Economic Affairs. They usually do the pre-budget consultations, post-budget studies, that type of thing. And so that committee's been expanded. There's Randy Hillier's on it, the Green, the Independent Liberal. So everyone gets a seat. Not everyone gets a vote, but everyone gets a seat. And they'll do a bit of a backwards and forwards study. So they'll look at the mini budget bill that the PCs put out back in March, and also study the recovery plan. So the committee's first meeting is actually next week. They're doing that. The committee side of things are going virtual here. And so the financial accountability officer will be attending next week, and same with the finance minister, which is pretty cool because the ministers in Ontario don't typically show up at committee meetings. So and the finance minister, Rod Phillips, has his own cabinet recovery committee meeting that's sort of working with the legislative committee, which the cabinet committee, because of cabinet confidence, that's not readily available to the public. So I think having the finance minister at the legislative committee is a big show towards transparency.
Oh, that's neat. It's just funny. I didn't realize ministers don't usually come, so that's just a quite a different process from the federal level.
Yeah.
But is there any effort to consider things that aren't related to COVID at present? Given that provinces also have so many other things that they need to deal with at the same time.
Yeah, so Ontario, this week the PCs laid out a motion that would bring back further committees beyond the COVID response study. And they have 4 bills on the order paper now. One is about expanding transit, changing the legal system, stuff that was tabled before the pandemic and really doesn't have much to do with it now. So they've restarted some committees to study those bills as usual. They've all been time allocated, which a lot of governments use, but they would allow for public hearings virtually, clause by clause consideration and the typical study throughout the summer. So that is coming back. But in terms of what's going on at the House, the only legislation that's being introduced now is pandemic related. There has even been backroom negotiations on the legislation itself. And the NDP had a problem with the last bill because there was two provisions that had nothing to do with the pandemic. And they were saying they weren't going to, I guess, maybe indicating they might not give unanimous consent to pass it quickly. So those were removed from the bill. They might come back. But I guess in terms of what's being new, that all seems very pandemic related. And the committees are starting to ramp up with, the normal business.
So has there been, perhaps I guess just as our last question, have you noticed a change in the way the government is communicating now that the legislature is sitting, a couple of days a week? Has it changed the way things are being managed? I mean, one of our recommendations from the report was that, if legislatures aren't sitting, there can't be oversight. There can't sort of be that day-to-day question. And I'm just wondering if you have seen any sort of change in tone or the nature of discussion.
I think optic-wise, certainly, there is more accountability because we are seeing at least twice a week question period. The Premier actually wasn't present for question period this week, but he was there last week. And I know that was a really big deal for the opposition, that they could stand up there and ask their questions. And I think that certainly optics-wise, this is having an impact. I think, in terms of the effectiveness of question period, I feel like that's a whole other conversation,
Right.
Question period, not answer period. But I think that certainly it's a good thing that question period is back.
Well, thank you so much, Sabrina. And hopefully you can stay for the questions as well.
Yeah.
And now we'll keep heading further east to JP Lewis in New Brunswick. Thank you so much for being here. So when we were going through the report, New Brunswick just stood out in so many ways for the all-party committee that was created, both especially relative to jurisdictions where it seems the opposition has just been shut out of discussions. I was wondering if you could give us an overview of how it came about and how it's worked.
Sure. So notably, we were possibly on the eve of an election. The opposition parties were threatening to bring down the government right before the pandemic hit. So it really went from partisanship at its highest level to suddenly the parties and leaders working together. Now it's been reported Dominic Carty, he's our Minister of Education, it was his idea. And notably some background on Dominic Carty, he was a former NDP leader and left the NDP, worked in Higgs's office, and now is the Minister of Education in the Progressive Conservative government. So it was a day after the first presumptive case in New Brunswick, so I believe March 12th. Our budget had passed in, I think, 17 minutes. And then they announced that they were forming this committee. And notably, the 3 other party leaders were sworn in. So that's Kevin Vickers, who does not have a seat in the legislature, the Liberal leader, Chris Austin, leader of the People's Alliance, and David Kuhn, the leader of the Green Party. And again, just the the political circumstances in New Brunswick right now, the Tories and the Liberals are tied with 20 seats each. The Greens and the People's Alliance are tied with 3 seats each. There's one independent who actually, he left the government soon before all of this happened, Robert Gauvin, who's deputy premier, and then there's 2 vacancies. So there would have been 2 by-elections that were both postponed.
Wow, so it was very much a situation where a government would have needed opposition support to continue on with its agenda. And so actually, just a reminder to our audience as well, if you would like to put any questions, we're going to take them in after speaking with JP. If you want to put them in the chat, please go ahead. So with the committee, how has that worked where it's out, you said it's a cabinet committee. And so has there been the same kind of legislative activity that you might see? Has there been an effort by the opposition parties to hold the government to account, or has it just been a situation where politics as normal is suspended?
Yeah, so there has not been regular legislative activity. I think they've had an afternoon sitting twice to get some COVID-related legislation through. And it's notable, there's 4, so there's the premier, the 3 other party leaders, and then 4 ministers on the committee. And up until now, and we'll get to, there's kind of breaking news in New Brunswick related to the legislature as of the last couple hours.
Oh gosh,
but,
okay.
But up until recently, all the leaders had said publicly that this appears, they thought it was working very well. And there was even a bit of a flare-up where a Liberal backbencher, Francine Landry, complained about testing levels, and then a few days later actually apologized publicly. So I'm not sure if Vickers had got involved or something, but, and even like, again, there wasn't a complete departure of politics. Vickers had talked about bringing down the government early on. He's changed his tone a bit on that, like bringing down the government as soon as this is done. He changed his tone on that. But I think the key point of all of this is the premier, Blaine Higgs, has been quite vocal about enjoying this managerial style of government, and complained publicly about, the legislature just gets in the way of things. He's talked about how having this sort of system doesn't mean in the future we might have to keep changing course because all the parties are in the government. It's like, so not that he isn't partisan himself, but there's some interesting dynamics going on with the, I think Julie had mentioned about the personalities within the institution. So, I mean, there's lots to talk about there.
And so do you have a situation where, so I'm just thinking from other places, say for example, in Ontario, we've seen concerns about care homes. And so it's the opposition raising those in question period to the government. If someone's not happy with how things are playing out in New Brunswick, they think something is problematic, is it more of the media versus now all of the parties together in the cabinet committee? I'm just wondering how, if there is a way to articulate that within the legislature, within the political system.
It's hard to say. I mean, we did have about a week ago, probably the biggest kind of political hiccup that this government had faced since the start of the pandemic was Higgs's ban on temporary foreign workers. There's a lot of pressure from, say, fish processing plants and farmers that they just wouldn't be able to function without letting the workers in. And there was a lot of attention in the media. Because the leaders are sworn to secrecy, we don't know what kind of pressure there was behind closed doors, but within days, Higgs had reversed his decision. So there was a change of course there. On probably, the one issue where there's been the most politics around it since the start.
And now, so the legislature resumed this week, but I understand the all-party cabinet committee is also still continuing. And so I'm just wondering how that's playing out. Is the legislature sort of resuming business as usual and trying to look at non-COVID related matters while the cabinet committee focuses on COVID, or is there a division of labor playing out in that regard?
So the legislature came back on, I just want to get this story straight because so the legislature comes back on Tuesday.
Right.
Wednesday, they actually had a planned committee meeting, a legislative committee meeting about non-COVID related legislation that is contentious. And it's actually related to vaccines, but not related to COVID vaccines. Some, if you follow New Brunswick news closely, may remember we had a measles outbreak about a year ago. And so the education minister introduced a bill to get rid of non-medical exemptions to vaccinations for school children. And it's contentious because there's actually the justice minister has come out in opposition. Anyways, they had that planned to, I guess yesterday midday, to meet. Cardi had to cancel that. They had to cancel that committee meeting because Cardi had an all-party cabinet committee related to COVID. And then as of today, and I would imagine that they are probably talking about, and again, if you follow New Brunswick news closely, we have an outbreak in Campbellton that involves a healthcare worker who had gone over to Quebec.
An outbreak of COVID-19, not measles.
Yeah, of COVID-19.
Okay.
And so anyways, today, Thursday, just while we were setting up this Zoom presentation, the legislature has adjourned again until June 9th.
Oh, okay. Because it had been the plan to resume sort of sitting week. Okay.
Yeah. So
you heard it here first, people. This is
the MLAs from the Campbellton area constituencies had gone back, and then some. So they're adjourned now until June 9th. So I can't say it's difficult to answer that question.
Okay. No, I didn't.
We started to see what might happen, but now we don't know. And now it's back just to the all-party cabinet committee and cabinet business.
So is there any, I mean, you mentioned the one Liberal MLA who had complained about testing levels and then later apologized. But I'm curious to see how, I mean, in Canadian politics is famous for having a very leader-centric culture. But in this context of having the leaders literally sitting beside the cabinet members, even if virtually, how backbench members are handling this? Because presumably they have been even further pushed to the margins without, even the chance to make a member statement or that sort of thing.
Honestly, I'm sure they're very busy dealing with constituency issues, but we haven't heard much. I think it's important to note that David Kuhn, the Green leader, is kind of a provincial version of Elizabeth May in terms of focusing on how the institution works, how the legislature works. I mean, in the past, he would have been the first MLA to complain about, say, a decrease in sitting days and things like that. I mean, he's on the inside now.
Right.
But he's definitely someone who, and he just had an editorial earlier in the week in the provincial newspapers, kind of praising the system. And even I should, before I forget, to note that because New Brunswick was doing well in terms of caseload, the chief medical officer was profiled in the Globe and Mail, Dr. Jennifer Russell, and she even praised the all-party cabinet committee in that article in her interview.
Oh, wow. No, so it's interesting. The other province with sort of an all-party committee has been Newfoundland and Labrador, but it's not a cabinet committee. It's more of a consultative body. And so there has been a few more squeaky wheels about the decisions made, although they're challenging because there was a Liberal leadership race on. But just this, fusion of the legislature and the executive is very distinct for what we are accustomed to in the Canadian context. And it almost sounds like New Brunswick now may be the third jurisdiction to have consensus government of some form, even if it's just among the parties.
Well, and again, breaking this morning was polls that Angus Reid poll showing that Blaine Higgs is the most popular premier in the country with 80% approval rating. The Narrative Research had polling come out yesterday showing the Tories are way up over the Liberals, almost at 50%. And the satisfaction rate of the government is at 81%.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
No, I mean, it's no one seems to be missing the legislature is the message. But now I think we, if it's okay, to our technical team, I guess the easiest way for questions might be if all of the panelists were visible, and so that we could see if anyone wanted to take a particular question. One question that's been put into the chat is whether, so Australia has a coordinating body between federal and provincial, federal and state leaders, I guess, to coordinate the response, but we haven't had sort of a similar council here. Did any of you hear whether, not kind of like, bringing everyone into the federal cabinet at the, the provincial leaders, has that sort of thing been contemplated here? Has there been a move to try to formalize that federal provincial cooperation? If
I haven't heard anything in New Brunswick, and I know where politics has emerged in the last few days is the premier and the provincial finance minister being somewhat critical of the federal approach, of the concern about the levels of spending. So at least speaking from New Brunswick, it doesn't appear that that's an option right now.
Okay. So another question. So one that we've had, again, through the chat is how are standing committees handling sort of public hearings? Julie, would you like to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, we just had a standing committee yesterday, a standing committee hearing yesterday with one of our statutory officers to go over her annual report. And so the committee members and staff were able to be physically apart in the committee room, and she joined us virtually, and that went very well. We were able to have a flowing conversation and get through that piece of business. The thing is that we're behind. I'm sure most legislatures are. These kind of statutory reports and responses should have happened before the end of the fiscal year, but they're happening now.
And so in that case, so that's interesting. So the members of the committee were physically present, but then the witness was appearing virtually. And have you done any committees with everyone being virtually, or has that happened?
Yes, the standing committees have only been virtual throughout the pandemic until we resumed on Tuesday, because the committees are spread out all over the NWT, the committee members. And so, yeah, we've been meeting virtually until this point.
So one question that has also come up is the extent to which the choices made in each jurisdiction was driven by the digital divide. And I'm just wondering, perhaps JP and Sabrina, whether this may have been part of the rationale for resuming sort of physically present sittings. New Brunswick is not necessarily, is known for having a lot of rural communities, but just if that element played in, as Julie mentioned earlier in the NWT, to focusing on a physical return as compared to a virtual return. Either.
Sure, I can.
Okay.
I mean, don't forget, New Brunswick had a Minister of Information Highway back in the 90s, so don't, No, I think it's hard to say in New Brunswick because you had this all-party committee, which seemed to be very popular with the members of it, and also because our caseload has been so low that there may have always been just a goal to be back in the legislature physically. And I don't think I mentioned this earlier. So when they were back this week, 19 of the members were sitting in the gallery, and the math, right? Anyways, and the rest were down on the legislature floor. So yeah, I think speaking just, from us delivering the rest of the term at UNB, there was definitely concern about internet access with our students. So, I mean, that may have been considered by the government or legislators.
Sabrina, did you want to add anything?
I mean, in Ontario, they don't seem keen on doing virtual sittings in the actual house, but that's mostly just being done at the committee level. And, you know, if you are far away, our committees are set up so that you can teleconference in if you're not comfortable making the trek. And I think you can even phone in too. So I think, yeah, the sittings itself don't seem to be going virtual here.
Okay. So, but actually, I mean, one thing, so when we chatted before this event, you had mentioned how there was one member of cabinet even who had been sort of self-isolating.
Yeah.
And so are there any provisions that are going to be made? If you could just mention that case and tell us, you know, is he going to be included or?
Yeah, well, actually, so I think we're talking about the seniors minister, Raymond Cho, who
Yeah.
was at a photo op yesterday in cardboard cutout form, which got a little bit of buzz on social media. And yeah, Raymond Cho is in his 80s, and the Ontario health officials have strongly recommended that people over 70 are self-isolating right now. So he's doing that. He's following the government's advice. And we've had a parliamentary, sorry, not a parliamentary, the Associate Small Business Minister had made an announcement on Raymond Cho's behalf the other day. So I think, I don't know if any others are over 80 off the top of my head,
Fair
but
enough.
I think that there is opportunities for people who might want to be you know, physically distance more. I mentioned the summertime sittings. So the PCs are proposing to pluck a page from the UK Parliament, actually, and they have lobby votes. So instead of standing up at your desk to say aye or nay, you can walk through the aye lobby or the nay lobby. And that way, if you're not in the House, you know, you're not one of those 42 MPPs that can be physically distanced for the debate, you can still vote and have like your vote recorded on Hansard in favor or against something through the lobby. And unfortunately, I have confirmed that the bells will be ringing for 30 minutes, but it is a longer, which might just be a personal annoying thing, but it's a longer time that all MPPs, no MPPs will not know that there's a vote happening, and they will be able to.
Okay. So I know we are at 1 o'clock. I had one more question that my brilliant colleagues have been curating through our chat box. If you have time, but just curious to know have you seen much of a change between legislators and their staff, or also between the staff of the Assembly itself and the members who are there as this has unfolded? Usually you would see ministers come with sort of a swarm of delegates around them. MPs rely very heavily on their staff. Things are often quite confidential. So I'm just wondering if you've seen any of those dynamics among the other people who are in the legislature changing.
I mean, I can speak to what's happening in Ontario. I mean, I think everyone is working, you know, under these conditions, and I think everyone's like very appreciative of it. The legislature in Ontario itself is just operating on an essential people-only policy. In fact, the speaker has actually been given this power to ban MPPs, but virtually anyone there's a new screening process that if you have symptoms that are related to COVID-19, that you won't be allowed into the building, and including elected officials, MPPs as well. This is just a temporary measure, but you are screened when you come in. And I believe I've been working from home, but I went last week to pick up some things, and security had told me only 15 people were in the legislature. So I think everyone is keeping their distance, and we're seeing a lot less staff and people around for sure.
Okay. Well, we are at time, and I want to thank JP and Julie and Sabrina in the order that you are on my screen for joining us. This is it's very hard to try to summarize the Federation in 1 hour, but thank you for helping us try. Thank you to everyone who's joined us as well. We unfortunately couldn't get to all of the questions, but we are going to try to see if we can respond to some of the points in the newsletter. And also, I just want to say this is my second last day with Samara, and I want to thank that organization for giving me the chance to do this kind of research. And I hope that you will all continue to come back for further events, because this is going to be a very important thing going forward to see how Canadian democracy can survive in the age of COVID. So thank you all so much for this.